going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. Um, my very deeply conflicted soul is joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tongva First Nation in Anaheim, California. Bold move to come stateside at the moment, but I have a 15-year-old kid who's not 100% capable of traveling on a group trip with sibling or with classmates without a little bit of parental backup support, who had a trip to Disneyland with their band scheduled and paid for long before the election. And so here I am being a mama and taking United Church Zoom calls from our hotel in California. I'm not actually going to Disneyland. I'll save that for a different administration. Um, and I'm so pleased. If you want to share where you're joining from around the country for our territorial acknowledgement, you're welcome to do that in the chat. And I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by my colleague and friend, Lori Ransom. So Lori is one of the staff at the General Counsel offices. And Lori, are you still co-executive minister?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So
Mhm.
for the last year has been serving as co-executive minister for Indigenous Ministries and Justice, and is also seconded half-time to the World Council of Churches and is the Indigenous staff person for the Indigenous Peoples Program for the WCC. And so convenes an ecumenical working group of Indigenous people from across the globe. And before coming to work in the general counsel offices, I think you also worked for a long time as a civil servant too, yeah?
I did.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, as you know, I've been able to get authors to come and talk with us and was not able to have the author of this book come talk with us. And when I thought of who I knew in church world who would be happy to discuss this book, Lori was my absolute first choice after the author, because of that breadth of experience that she has. And Lori's also been working on a really interesting project on reducing and eliminating spiritual violence against Indigenous peoples too, which has been really important work that that it will be in service of the church. So Lori, welcome. Do you want to add anything to?
Just a couple of things. Good evening, everyone. Lovely to be with you, and lovely have an opportunity to discuss Jody Wilson-Raybould's book this evening. Just a little bit more about my background briefly. I'm joining you from my home in downtown with Toronto, which is the territory of the Two-World Wampum Treaty, home over time to both Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. Myself, on my father's side, I am Algonquin from Eastern Ontario, a community called Pikwakanagan, which is on the, for those who know Ontario, is on the southeastern edge of Algonquin Provincial Park. So about 150 or so kilometers kind of northwest of Ottawa. And on my mother's side, quite a mix of European backgrounds. So in addition to time with the federal government, and I thought, Carmen, moderator, that was perhaps why you selected me. And I remember part of that time, after working, I was also seconded to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then was briefly back in government following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and crossed paths with, at that point, Minister Raybould. Was 2 months or a few days in a downtown hotel doing pre-consultations for the missing and murdered Indigenous women's working and girls working inquiry. And Minister Raybould was there, and we spent 2 days with families of survivors. So I had an opportunity to witness Minister Raybould in action for a couple of good solid days, which was quite interesting. So a little bit more about me.
Super. And on top of the fact that I have a pretty wicked cold, which I'm sure those of you who know me well can hear it in my voice a little bit, and I might have to go blow my nose at some point. Um, I also will confess to all of you that I'm human and I didn't finish the book this time. I tried my best. I'm in the middle of getting ready to move to Ontario from BC, and I think that I must have packed it, but thought it was in Toronto or Vancouver, and then waited sort of until the last minute, like looking in both cities for the book and couldn't find it. And I bought an ebook version for my e-reader, but then didn't get it finished in the last week. So I'm also going to rely on, on Lori for having been the one to complete the assignment and read the book for this evening. I did talk to somebody in the general counsel office who said that they had read the book and they found it a difficult read. I didn't find that. It was just my own time management skills that kind of bit me on this one. And so yeah, I would love to know from you, Lori, just to start. And I finished the educate part, but didn't get to the second two pieces, but would love to know what your thoughts are just about the book in general.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. It's interesting that someone called it a difficult read, and I wonder whether they were referring to difficult in terms of the heaviness of the subject matter,
Yeah.
as opposed to difficulty actually reading the text. Because one of the things I was struck by is just for me, it was a very accessible book and a very quick read. And I think not only because for myself, of course, I'm familiar with the subject matter, but that aside, I did find it quite, quite written at quite an engaging level, which is often difficult to do. A lot of the material out there about these topics can be quite academic and quite a heavy read. It's always heavy in terms of the content. So I'm interested in that comment you received. I also found that there was this nice kind of organization which she struck to, which, as you just noted, began with the topic of education, then moved on to the notion of understanding what you've been educated about. We can say more about that. And then the action section. And then sandwiched in between, helpfully, at least in my copy, in a different color, were pages that spoke to that took one through the history. And that part might have been more difficult for the person you were speaking to. I would think that without any exposure to history, that might be the more difficult section of the book to actually follow, because if you don't really have a sense, as she's taking excerpts of things like the Royal Proclamation and then, the Indian Act and et cetera, that without further explication might be difficult. At the same time, one of the things I really appreciated about that section was that in a stronger way than I've seen in other similar kinds of books, she and her collaborators made a real effort to find Indigenous voices in the historical record and bring them through all the way through that historical section. So many books rely on kind of the settler, historical documents and voices. And often when you talk to people, well, there just wasn't much, it's hard to find those Indigenous voices. Yes, it is, but that makes it all the more impressive. What she's done with this book is they've made the effort to find the records and to lift up those voices over time. So you're seeing, what Indigenous people were saying from the time of, as I said, the Royal Proclamation right through to today. And of course, obviously today it becomes it's much easier to find Indigenous voices. But also I think, her formula, that, which I'll repeat again, that Learn, Understand, Act, was great, particularly this notion of understanding, which we may want to explore this evening a bit more, because I think most in the United Church have understood the importance of education and educating themselves about the history. And it's been a failing of Canadian educational systems for generations, that we haven't taught our kids enough about that history to really grasp it. But the understanding section I found was quite interesting, because Raybould talks about notions of worldview and how important it is to understand and to value and appreciate that, Indigenous peoples, among many other peoples across the world, bring a different worldview.
Yeah.
And worldviews plural, as she notes,
Mm.
although with some commonalities to their interactions with people from another culture. And it's not that any one worldview is wrong, they're different, and they're huge implications, particularly when it comes to moving forward together, in terms of, reconciliation and making real progress and real change in terms of, systems and how we do business together and how we make decisions. If we don't get that, if we go quickly from education and then skip to action without appreciating the implications of worldview, that's, I think, where we get into lots of difficulties. So,
Yeah, I love that. I wondered about if that was also a piece that made the first section especially harder to read, because I kept thinking like, oh, this is really interesting. She's skipping from all of these historical records. Also noted the number of Indigenous voices from across the periods of history that she included. Um, but thought like this is like the most Indigenous thing ever, is like, I'm not going to tell you the story. I'm going to let the community tell you the story. Um, and I wondered if that was even in itself, and I'd be interested to hear from others when we come to a broader discussion, if that felt um, like like a piece of like intercultural growing edge around having multiple voices telling these stories across multiple generations as the means of telling the education part. And then also um yeah, appreciating the nuance about worldview and the fact that like there's this tension between um the the reality that there is a multiplicity of Indigenous worldviews, as many as there are different Indigenous cultures and languages, and that we have more in common with each other than we did with like Euro-Christian society
mhm,
settlers, right?
right.
And the first woman to get her PhD, the first Native American woman to get her PhD in philosophy was a woman named Viola Cordova, who is Dene from New Mexico or Arizona. I can't remember which. And she she talked about that in some of her writing that was published after she died, about how um, that there's not like one Indigenous way of looking at things. And yet when we talk about an Indigenous taking an Indigenous approach to something, or like sharing Indigenous worldviews, that we have more in common with each other than we do with Europeans, just like there are different schools of philosophy. Like there's a Frankfurt School of Philosophy and there's a French School of Philosophy, and though they're very different and nuanced to people who study philosophy, but they're more similar to each other than they would be to Indigenous worldviews or cosmovisions from other places in the world. And yeah, so I appreciated that, not only because that also is a big part of what I wrote my dissertation about for my for my own PhD, was trying to make that argument, right? That I wasn't speaking on behalf of
Yeah.
all Indigenous people, and there are still these threads that we can pull out that are important.
Mhm.
And I um I will look forward to going and reading the understand section, because I feel like that is an important part of like how we engage in critical thinking, is to like really understand what we're doing. And I think that like even for something as simple as land acknowledgements, if if you don't understand why you're doing or haven't put thought into it, then it can be a piece of like performative action that does is really meaningless. But if you're very thoughtful about how you do it, it can be about building relationships and also reaffirming Indigenous rights and title in this country, on a social scale. And both those things are true at the same time, depending on the level of education and care, I think, that's put into development of a land acknowledgement.
Yeah, you'll find when you get to that site, she does have a section where she speaks about land acknowledgements, and I really appreciated how she did that, because she takes on the critiques that are out there and entirely valid about it being performative, while also speaking to, you know, the value, and as she puts it, a kind of first step towards, you know, reminding, you know, oneself, you know, about that history and of the importance of the, you know, the people who lived here, and that there is, you know, that there were original custodians of the land. But she pushes it further nicely in a way that I found helpful around kind of what is the next kind of steps to think about post land acknowledgement, pointing to how, you know, at a local level, you know, she would encourage, you know, cities, towns, groups to think about, okay, what kind of local protocols do you then set up between a community and yourself as a group around how you're going to work together or make decisions, and that, you know, taking into account that worldview, or perhaps there's a, you know, even further, there's a joint action plan that can be developed around moving forward in a good way together. So again, I found it quite helpful that she, you know, she spoke to those as possible next steps to having a land acknowledgement. I think one of the things that I also appreciate, because it's been, you know, you always love it when someone is kind of validating your own perspective on something. And I'm often asked, as I'm sure you're often asked, about the Indian Act and why it's so difficult to, you know, to abolish the Indian Act and replace it. And the worldview piece speaks into that. And, you know, having worked in the federal government and in the 90s, when there were a number of efforts to amend the Indian Act, some of which are successful. And I think we all have to remind ourselves there have been many amendments to the Indian Act, many, and they're probably, I don't know, haven't counted them, but probably now at least a dozen, perhaps 2 dozen separate pieces of legislation that govern Indigenous people's lives in the country now, because the Indian Act is in some ways being dismantled. And often, you know, there's a piece of legislation that a First Nation community can opt into on an optional basis, or but they don't have to. But one of the big challenges on the worldview piece with amending that Indian Act, and she speaks about this, and I completely agree with it, is the pressure on any one government to do something, to amend something as fundamentally significant to Indigenous communities within the life cycle of one government it's prohibitive, really. That, you know, it, and we don't seem to have a system that says, okay, you know, I'm coming in and I want it as a government and I want to start the process, but there's no way I can, there's no way I can do the kind of consultation across this vast nation that is, you know, would be required with the Indigenous community to really understand where Indigenous people want to, you know, want to go with this. There's absolutely no way we can do it in the life cycle of a 4-year, you know, 4-year government, where you really only have about 2 years before you're into another election cycle. And it's been a huge challenge to government. I was part of initiatives to try to do that, including the First Nations Governance Act, which some on this call will probably recall, that just kind of fell flat on its face because we didn't have the time to really do a proper consultation. So
And
it's a big change. Yeah, go
we're
ahead.
seeing, I was just going to say, we're seeing play out in front of us from this country where I am right now, what happens when you just like rapidly like rip the Band-Aid off and make massive changes to
Yep.
public policy without thinking through all of the implications. And you know, I think it's going to be devastating for this country. And I know that it would, there are some governance, like I think my tribal council would probably actually be okay and ready to move into a position where they did feel like they had enough resources, like financial resources and also capacity resources within our community to do that. But I know that we are like among the very, very, very few nations across the country who are in a place where we actually could step out of the relationship with the Indian Act and not have things just sort of fall apart.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else from the understand part that really jumped out at you that you thought was important?
Um, as I say, I think it was the worldview, the examples she spoke to. Um, yeah, I mean, she talked as well, I think, about a kind of two, and this might have been more in the ACT section, kind of at a national policy level. She talked about kind of the two levels on which action is required. One being to deal with the socioeconomic problems in the country that persist, clean water, access to education, appropriate child and family services, you know, education, all of the kind of basics that the federal government maintains responsibility for, and just despite the billions that are poured in, just our progress has occurred, but it's still painfully slow. And as a colleague of mine in Indigenous ministry said, lives continue to be lost. I mean, that's how serious it is on the Indigenous side, even as governments and others can mark, well, we've made progress here, we progress there, but individuals are still, not only falling through the cracks, but suffering quite egregiously because of a lack there. So and that's always been, the easiest quote unquote sell to the general electorate, or any, people understand, okay, we got to take care of people, even though they haven't done it well. The second track is the more, is the more challenging track, in, dismantling the Indian Act is part of it, but it's the rights track, to really move forward on self-government. And this is where, the way we work with the Indigenous community gets in the way too, is that again, as governments shift, you almost kind of got to go back to see, you move forward a little bit and then you go back, because you then have suddenly a new group of negotiators with a whole new set of mandate, etc. And so these negotiations can drag on for decades, as they have with my own community, for example. So real progress on the rights front um, has actually, and she speaks to this somewhat, been driven as much by the courts as anyone else. Because as Indigenous people, take things to court, and the courts, uphold Indigenous rights, then, that has more than anything pushed governments on any number of things to say, okay, we've got to change our policy, because there's a court decision here, usually at the Supreme Court level, it says we've got to. And unfortunately, we've had a government who's respected court decisions, right?
Yeah.
Enough
For
to
now.
say we gotta move. But that's the
Yeah.
danger too, right? Is that it's, what happens if we're so unfortunate as to get a government that stopped, just kind of ignored what the courts did and said, well, we don't care.
I mean, there's also tensions too, though, right? Like I'm looking at the tricky spots that, like, the government of British Columbia is finding itself in now, because
Mhm.
they implemented the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And then when they looked at, like, so for those of you who are not from British Columbia, the DRIPA Act in BC says that the government of British Columbia will engage in wide-scale law reform to make sure that every piece of legislation in the province is consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is a massive undertaking. And like, the progress is moving very, very, like, glacially slow, for all the valid reasons that Lori just said. But in the last provincial election, that one of the platforms from I don't know, whatever the right of center party was, it's changed a million times in BC. And um, the Kevin Falcon was the leader that was running for, would have been elected premier if that party had won enough seats. Basically was running on the platform of, we're going to repeal the DRIPA Act, because they didn't want those law reforms to happen. And I could not be more proud of the fact that it's a United Church minister who I trust, that is the new Minister of Reconciliation in British Columbia. Um, and I can't imagine how hard it's going to be for her to, like, in the years that they have a mandate, to start to, like, pick and choose which ones are the biggest, which ones are the most impactful and easiest that they can actually get some traction on. And then there's others that are just going to be so gnarly and facing so much, like, lobbying resistance from industries and everything, and it's tough. And I'm also grateful for DRIPA because my daughter has been studying for her fish and wildlife ID, so she'll and her firearms permit so she can go hunting with my brother. And for this year, it's not a problem because she'll be issued the ID in British Columbia. And so as long as they're fishing, as long as they're hunting outside of Health Territory, but they're following other provincial guidelines for hunting, it's not a problem. But in 2026, when she would go to renew it, she would be a resident of Ontario. And so the way the provincial guidelines work is that if you're not a resident of British Columbia and you want to come into British Columbia to hunt, then you have to hire a registered outfitter. Like you can't just come and go hunting. And so if she went home to Bella Bella, she could go hunting in our traditional territory even without her FWID. But my brother doesn't live in Bella Bella. He lives in Victoria, and he would be taking her hunting in like southern Vancouver Island, which is not our traditional territory. And so I wrote to Christine and I was like, here's a really sticky question for you as Minister of Reconciliation. Like, how, like for a minor who wants to come home and go hunting, who is otherwise licensed, going hunting with an otherwise licensed Indigenous person in the territory where he lives, as long as it's within the provincial guidelines that apply off reserve, like why couldn't my kid come home and go hunting with her uncle? So that was like my like, hey, is this like just a simple thing that we can fix so that my daughter can continue to go hunting? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Terrence to take her in Ontario. But
yeah, but it speaks to an interesting thing about Indigenous rights is that they're treated as if rights are frozen in time, right? At some historical, this is what the right was, and that persists, and doesn't account for the fact that societies inevitably evolve and grow, and people move, etc. So shouldn't the right also shift, and conform, be interpreted in terms of the context of the times? I mean, fortunately in this country, we've done that to some extent with treaties, we interpret that medicine chest in some of the numbers treaties. Okay, there's some right to health care, right? It begs questions around, as you say, hunting rights. Are they somewhat transportable for Indigenous people across provincial boundaries, as Indigenous people would move, etc. I mean, there are all kinds of things to think about there. One of the things I was going to remark about, as you were talking about the UN Declaration, is people may not be aware, although Canada was one of the holdouts until the middle of this the early part of this century in terms of signing on to the UN Declaration, and holdouts along with Australia, New Zealand, and the United States in terms of signing on to it. We eventually did. But we've been pretty well first out of the gate as a nation, along with, I think, I stand to be corrected, I think it's Belize. I could have the wrong country, but we're only one of two countries who not only has signed on to the declaration, but has actually passed legislation in a national parliament that says we're going to implement the UN Declaration, which is a good thing.
I think
Yeah,
Ecuador also,
okay.
I don't know if I don't know if they repealed it or not. Like I know it was because I was at the permanent forum in 2006, so the year that it was passed with the WCC, and there was somebody from CLI that was from Ecuador, and he ran for parliament like right after the permanent forum. But I think like not long after it passed at the UN, they enshrined it in their constitution,
Okay,
the commitment
right.
to it. But I know that also created a bunch of resistance and pushback. So I don't know if it stayed in the constitution because I know
Mhm.
that president's no longer president. And I know much more now about Latin American politics than I did before I married somebody from Latin America.
Right.
And I know they can tend to be a little bit more volatile and like jumping back and forth with big huge policy shifts like that. So I don't know if they stayed holding it, but
Right.
and I
But
think Bolivia tried to, but I think Morales got a lot of, like, the American government basically supported resistance to indigenous governance in Bolivia when he became president. So
right, yeah. But the good thing about it now being legislated in Canada is, again, it comes back to Indigenous people, if they need to, can now, take the matter to the courts in the and say,
yeah,
hey, you're not living up to your own legislation, as opposed to saying, okay, it's hard to litigate adherence to an international, aspirational document. That while many have signed on to, again, is there's a huge gap between what is said in the declaration and where countries are actually at in terms of living up to everything that it says. Yeah.
yeah. I appreciated that in the educate section she also talks about, like, not the sheer number of cases that indigenous communities have litigated up until the Supreme
Mhm.
Court,
Mhm.
and how important that is. And I was thinking about the ACT piece, and as many of you will know, the United Church of Canada um, Foundation and the United Church of Canada Pension are both members of an organization called SHARE, which is the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. And it's a group of institutional investors who basically use their investment in different equities to move the needle on environmental, social, and governance standards. And so I can't remember if I think I was at First United. I'd left Eco Justice and I was on the pension board, and I went to the TC Energy AGM because Share was putting forward a shareholder proposal on behalf of the pension board to ask that that the shareholders would ask the board to make a mandatory declaration on an annual basis on their progress on reconciliation. And they changed the venue of the AGM outside of downtown Calgary, because it was also when the Friday climate strikes were happening. And they I don't love the term, but they like red washed the whole meeting. Like everything it was out at the Saddle Dome, and everything about the look and feel of the meeting was all, Cree, um, and Stony Nakota culture. And they had a beautiful video about about one particular student. I'm sure it was a case study, but they had, talked to him, and he wanted to be an engineer. So they paid for his schooling. And like now he worked for TC Energy, and life was great and everything was excellent economically for their communities. And aren't they wonderful? And their proxy advice to shareholders was basically, we're taking steps on reconciliation, so we don't need to report it. And I think that they expected me to get up and say, like, from, my very United Church, like, social justice, like, this is the right thing to do, you need to report on it. And I just said, I get it. You guys are a business, and you have your biggest constituency is your shareholders and earning a financial profit. And what I will tell you is that when companies don't do this well, we sue them, and they often lose. So I don't understand what getting tied up in litigation for decades is going to, like, improve your bottom line, whether you have a single bottom line or triple bottom line. And so I would encourage shareholders to vote for this, because if you want to earn better dividends from this company, you don't want them getting caught up in litigation because they're not doing free, prior, and informed consent, and then they're not engaging with Indigenous people. So you want to know how they're engaging with Indigenous people. So we should have a voluntary declaration or a mandatory declaration. And you could see, like, the CEO and, like, all their faces kind of like, what? That is not what we expected her to say. And they were expecting that we would get like 2 to 3% of the vote, and we got 11% of the vote, which
Mm.
was enough to make them sit up and take notice. And so they scheduled, like, subsequent meetings to be like, okay, so make the business case for why this is important. And I think that is, like, the the more and more the courts like reaffirm those rights, the more important that is for our people, because eventually then we'll just be like, don't take us to court because you will lose. I also thought a lot about having read an Indian in the Cabinet, after her departure from the Liberal Party, and then thinking about, the way in which she was using this book as an opportunity to help people understand a way to actually make, like, embody reconciliation in a way
Mhm.
that I think is really helpful. Like, just what a shame it was that she clashed with Trudeau and Bennett in the way that she did, or that
Yeah.
they clashed with her, that they resisted the sheer brilliance that she had to offer
Mhm,
the
mhm,
country,
mhm.
because she has the legal training to, like, actually see the through lines of how to map out changes in a way that would be systemic and life-giving to Indigenous communities. And when I read an Indian in the Cabinet and I saw, like, Bennett's response was basically, no, we're going to continue on a nation to nation basis. I was like, yep, divide and conquer. Like, that's been our government's MO for forever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, Bennett was still in power then, so she had to toe the party line lest she also, run into issues. Yeah, I think a lot of
Yeah.
us were, hugely disappointed to see what unfolded there when it didn't have to happen. But it's unquestionably, a very difficult road for Indigenous people to get into positions of power like that. I remember and I think he was the first Indigenous person to be a deputy minister of what was then Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, before the department was split. And his name, I can see him, and his name is escaping my memory right now. And just, the how conflicted he felt, around the role. And he also spoke, and I thought this was really interesting, and it kind of speaks to the need about yeah, you'll be aware, Carmen, that, that in the U.S., the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is kind of a parallel to what we have up here, although the environment, the policy environment is quite different. But the Bureau is largely Indigenous in the U.S.
Mhm.
And oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. The DM was saying he didn't want Indigenous affairs to become an Indigenous ghetto, because he spoke about the importance of having Indigenous people in departments across the federal government, so that you would have those voices in positions of power who could influence policy across the board. And she, in that worldview section, when you get to it, she speaks of how it played out at the cabinet level, in that where she had thought even as an Indigenous politician, accustomed to being able to debate matters around a table like a cabinet table, the degree to which that she found that was not the case at Canadian cabinet was quite, and she might have spoken. I didn't read Indian in the cabinet, so she may have spoken it there, that there was very little, scope for, creative conversation around a table like where she could really use her voice. And that's an unfortunate reality of how our governments have done business up until this time. And when we speak about decolonization, that's what, this is part of what Indigenous people are driving at, that it's at the fundamental level about how organizations govern themselves and take decisions that, Indigenous people feel things need to be changed, because there you have, as you said, a really, highly educated, brilliant, Indigenous woman, kind of boxed in terms of her ability to influence policy. And even when, after torturous, kind of work, she did manage to get a framework around Indigenous policy. I can't quite remember the title off the
Yeah.
top. Published. She wasn't at all convinced that it was being given lip service. like the UN Declaration in many parts of the world, as opposed to be really being, adopted and grasped and leading to fundamental change. So, I mean, fortunately, we continue, and Indigenous people, despite her experience, continue to stand for election. We now have an Indigenous premier in Manitoba, the first south of the north, which is great. And these are barriers, that are continue to need to be broken. And they're trailblazers who are going to run into challenges, and some unfortunately will find that that's not the right milieu for them and have to leave. But eventually, one can hope that there'll be enough experience that Indigenous worldviews will penetrate these corridors of power and make people sit up and realize, hey, there's a different way, of doing things that can lead to positive change for everyone, not just for the Indigenous people. So
so the last question I almost always ask everyone is, why is this an important book for the church to be reading?
yeah.
If you have thoughts on that, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Well, again, I'd go back to kind of what I said off the top, in that I think, it's particularly, in the United Church, where so many have now got a reasonably good level of education around, Indigenous history. I'm sure that, people may feel that they want to learn more, and that's great, they should learn more, etc. But with a kind of basic understanding of the history, I think, because it's a reasonably quick read, it's kind of ideal for a study group conversation about, and I'd even say if a group within the church has got relationships with the Indigenous communities nearby, or people that they've had in to speak, etc., why not have a kind of mixed group, Indigenous people, settler folks, and study the book and wrestle with that section on worldview, and how that plays out in reality, including within the church. Talk about that action piece, and maybe ask the question, okay, where do we go? We're now doing a land acknowledgement. What next, in terms of, is there an opportunity for some work together in our local community? Some communities will be better placed for others than others in terms of being able to work with an Indigenous community or organization, but or maybe there are other things one could do. And you were speaking about kind of financial ways in which groups can call. Jody Wilson-Raybould does in her book speak about uh, how communities can use the power of resources, a piece of their budget to support a local institution, or to fundraise for a local institution that is doing good and important work that could use some money. So there's that. I mean, there is a movement among some churches, in both, primarily from the Mennonite tradition in both the US and to some extent in Canada, around dismantling the doctrine of discovery, that is encouraging churches, for instance, to take a portion of their budget and to donate it to a local Indigenous organization of their own choice. So, I mean, that's a possible strategy. There are any number of ways. So I think the simple enough, learn, understand, act formula that she writes about, is leads for a really great framework for a church community to to use it as a study piece.
Yeah, I especially like that one. I think we've been talking a lot in General Council Executive around reparations, and like needing to develop a theology and a commitment around reparations, and how we approach that together as a church. And not that that has to be like literally land back in every instance, but on reserve it can certainly be that, I think, for sure. And I know many regional councils have developed policies to say that when there's a dispossession of property by the region, that anywhere from 5 to 15% of the sale of the proceeds of the sale of that property would go to the Indigenous Ministries and Justice budget. But I'm just looking to see if I can find the link for the report that stated it, but there was a report done in 2018 that showed in Canada only 1% of philanthropic money raised in Canada goes to Indigenous charities. Like
Doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
99% of all of the money raised by charities doesn't only 1%, like out of all of the money, which is something like $30 billion a year or something, only 1% goes to Indigenous charities. And so finding ways to not only just partner with Indigenous communities, but the charities that are supporting their work. Or I think the CRA is also loosening their restrictions. And so there hasn't always been an incentive for Indigenous grassroots organizations to get their charitable status, because the people who are donating at the grassroots level are generally the people that in that community that live on reserve. And if you live on reserve and work on reserve and you don't pay taxes, then a tax receipt isn't an incentive. So there's no reason to get charitable status. But then that also means that people who would like to benefit from a charitable tax donation receipt can't give to those organizations because they're not registered. But I think the CRA has now said on reserve grassroots organizations are qualified donees. But I don't know if that affects I think that helps with getting institutional philanthropic money from foundations, but not necessarily from individuals. And so that's a thing that I think that we could take a look at. And we're at like 4:20, so I'm wondering, Alan, if we can unmute folks, and folks might have questions for Lori or comments on the book. And while we're doing that, I'm going to look and see if I can find that report, and I'll put the link in the chat.
Just let people start talking willy-nilly, eh, moderator?
Let people start talking willy-nilly. It'll be like whack-a-mole. Who's going first?
You can still put up your hand if you want to be super polite and we'll spotlight you and all those things, or you can just start unmuting yourself and talking now. It's allowed.
Nobody wants to say nothing.
We do have somebody now, moderator, even though you're looking for links for things and
I
can't figure it out.
am. Dr. Gardell.
No, not.
Edith.
Well, I start because I'm the dumbest. It's the first time in my life that I participate in a book club. And it was this book which really spoke to me. I had to participate for various reasons, because not only was I until a few years ago in the government, but I followed Miss Wilson-Raybould, of course, in her fantastic career and also in her difficulties. And she impressed me from day one. I knew that she was in her position as Attorney General and Minister of Justice, and that followed through till the last day in the government. So she was a wonderful example to me. And I found she irradiated, not only in her book, but in her whole person, she irradiates a groundedness. And it comes through in the book also. She is proud of her heritage, and she knows where she comes from. She is groomed and born into leadership, and she knows that. And all that creates a certain clarity in her speech and in her way she presents herself. It's absolutely a wonderful book, I feel. And it's, to me, it wasn't hard to read. It was just wonderful, flowing and educational, and the way she constructs it with learning, understanding, acting. It's such a logical a flow of thought, and it shows her clarity of thinking. It was a wonderful book, I must say. And the other point I want to make is that she comes, what you say, Laurie, with the worldview. She comes from a long history. The European and Middle East history is all very young compared to the indigenous history. They think in 10,000 years. The Europeans think in thousands of years. There is a dimension, a difference, and it shows she has that knowledge, the deep knowledge from her ancestors, which has been brought to her and which she has inhaled probably from early years on. And it all is reflected in the book very well. So it's, and she also speaks of the long game. This is not, reconciliation is not a short sprint, a year long, but it's a generational effort. It has to really grow and lived out. All this is so convincing to me. I was very, very grateful to have the opportunity to read the book and to also share it here.
Thank you, Ida. That, as you were speaking, one of the things that I was reminded of, that I haven't said much about how much I think Indigenous people will appreciate this book. And it's exactly as you spoke about it, in that, number one, she does present herself in a way that is going to be familiar to Indigenous people in terms of, she talks about her family and how that influenced her and the importance of her own story and her own people's story, and that weaves through. But also, and it's something that I think, we as a faith community can learn is, there's a section where she lifts up the creation stories of different Indigenous peoples, communities, with complete respect and reverence for, with no criticism, whatever, etc. It's just, these are the views of other peoples, and these are the story, and this is the wisdom, from those traditions. And we, so often we have come out as Christians of a kind of hierarchy of religions where we want to beat up other belief systems, etc. And there's another path that she models in there, in terms of, speaking about other groups. There was another hand, I thought. Was it Carol, perhaps? Yeah.
Hi. I know what that other person, he or she said. It had some difficulty reading it. If you're not familiar with a lot of the concepts, it's a lot to take in. Wow. But on the other hand, now that I'm almost finished, I'm thinking I have learned so much. And just, I was out of the country for 40 years, and coming back into Canada, and all of a sudden residential schools, and thinking, what happened while I was away? What is all of this? And she's helped me understand so much. And the word privilege, they talk about privilege, and it's different than what I knew of as privileged, but it explains so much. And I can understand now. I can appreciate, maybe I don't totally understand by any means, but I can appreciate why Indigenous people are, I won't say angry, but frustrated, because they've obviously been at this angle for so long, and it must be extremely frustrating to get, that governments don't even recognize that, yes, there were treaties, and the pure lies in history. And it kind of made me angry, but that's a good thing normally. And I really appreciate that you chose this book for the book club, because of all of them, I think this is probably my favorite, because again, as a learning experience, and again, the conversation today has been very good and helpful in terms of, again, practical implications of that. So I thank you.
That's great, Carol. Yeah, you're kind of affirming what I suspected in terms of particularly that history section. There's a ton of information in there, and if it's your kind of first, or if you've only had a limited exposure, that would be the section I would think would be the most difficult to follow. And she does helpfully include a short list, and it is a short list of other books that one can turn to go deeper. And of course, we all know there's lots of history out there to go to as well. But thank you.
And I think, Lori, you said something that, like, for people who haven't been reading this history or haven't been understanding like all of those threads that she pulled together in the educate section, you said something really important, which was the amount of effort that would have been required to go and to pull out the extant written records from Indigenous voices. When I was working on my comprehensive exams for my PhD, I had read Susan Nayland's book, The Heavens Are Changing, which was about the Tsimshian catechists in the early Methodist Church in the northwest coast of British Columbia. And I thought, okay, she's approaching this from a historical perspective, but what if I went back and read these records from a theological perspective and could kind of like pull out the theologies of these records? And so I proposed this as my exam. And then I went to go and like dig through our United Church archives, and I realized that she had, for her doctoral work, she had gone to Chicago, to Ottawa, to Toronto, to London, and the sheer volume of Indigenous records that are housed in London in the archives from the early church, especially the early Protestant church interactions with Indigenous people, is like there's way more in London than there is anywhere in Canada. And I thought, okay, this is like way beyond the scope of what I can access for my comprehensive exams. So my exam was also a reflection on learning like how difficult it is to find the records of Indigenous peoples like early relationships with Canadians. And I think that probably gets even harder the further east you go, because it's an older, in British Columbia, I think in the Pacific Northwest, we say that like settler colonialism didn't really hit until the late 1790s. And like the first non-Indigenous woman to live west of the Rockies didn't cross the Rockies until like 1836 or something like that. So we're in a very young part of the country, and we don't even have like the whole picture, and so many of those records are not even in our own province. So I think we've been really lucky in some ways that we have had these national inquiries and commissions, and like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People is such a beautiful resource. And I was glad she mentioned that too, because it is not hard to read. It was written really, really well, but it is really hard to access, because I think when it came out, it was like $1,000 for all the volumes. And so it was really, they priced it for institutions like libraries to have it. And then now a lot of public libraries don't even have it in their reference section anymore. And the full text of the Royal Commission report is on an archived website, but it's not maintained by the government of Canada. And if it breaks, then it breaks, right? So I've been looking for like a full copy of the RCAP report for forever. Because that incorporated millions and millions and millions of pages of research. But yeah, there's so much to learn and to understand.
Yeah.
It's
been interesting too. One of the helpful ways that churches, particularly older churches and people connected to churches who may no longer be, is that oftentimes there's correspondence from, indigenous communities or other, there's a treasure trove that can occasionally emerge from, churches across the country of information, from historical information and communication from indigenous peoples, that can, needs to be preserved if found and, properly archived, and that can help tell that story and the voices that come out of, it. I mean, one of the interesting comments that I remember hearing when I was working for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from indigenous people was how much some of those early church records that existed in indigenous languages, those early translations of hymns or sermons or etc., were written examples of even the language that had been preserved in a way that was really, really helpful today, to indigenous communities wanting to recover that information. So it just speaks to the importance of preserving information that is out there, how precious that is to researchers, and how easily it can be lost. Certainly the TRC has a large section around the importance of archives and their work. I think RCAP did as well. But it's, preserving that information, making sure it's accessible to Indigenous peoples is a real ministry, and should never be undervalued in terms of, its potential.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections from other members of the book club? Well, thanks, Edith. Edith sent me a message, and I'll just copy and paste it in for the whole group. That there's an excellent learning resource for anybody else who wants to continue their education part, which is the Indigenous Canada Coursera, which is a free University of Alberta course for learning at your own pace. My husband had to do it for work and learned a lot that he didn't know before. I mean, he's married to me, so he knows some stuff, but
yeah, I agree. I took it out of curiosity because people were commending it, and as someone who's often asked, what, is it good or not? So I thought I better take a look at this, and I would agree. It's just excellent, and easy. So yeah, you got a couple more hands.
So Bruce and then James.
Hi. I was really moved by the book and one of the points that struck me in the understanding section was how well she articulated the feelings of an Indigenous people facing colonial society. And it took me back to my reading of White Fragility, when I was so struck by that feeling of I guess, confidence and approval and power from my own life, and then realizing that was not earned at all. It was just in the air that I checked off a bunch of boxes. But neither is the humiliated, ignored feeling of Indigenous people earned in any way at all. And I thought, there's a basis for understanding one another right here in the stuff that we think about ourselves that really has nothing to do with ourselves. It has to do with that batch of society that we were raised in. So there's a real equality of people here made to feel in ways that they don't deserve to feel. And it struck me a lot in that section on understanding, but I started to pick out of it was understanding how Indigenous people feel and the conflict between those feelings and the core of their culture, which, thank heavens, is getting more and more articulated and expressed. And it just, it gives me a lot of hope to see that renewal of their culture. And they've done that on their own in spite of our society. I mean, Roy Henry Vickers, people who, key artists, the Newman family out in Souk have done so much to express and give occasion for pride, that they have carried that through dark, dark, dark times and still own a tremendous depth. And the more we can understand, hear those strengths in their culture, and Jody Raybould is a tremendous example of that. The better it is to shake us up and drop a whole lot of bright lights into our understanding of Canadian culture.
Thanks, Bruce. Two things came to mind as you were speaking. One, it speaks on a theological level. It speaks to the work that every human being has to do to understand one's own brokenness, right? And the need for healing, and that brokenness can come from being, part of a society where one has had unearned privilege, and has been part of a group that has hurt another group, and you've talked about the other group. But the other thing that I was really struck by was you reminded me of something that Jody wrote about around, and she was quoting someone else, I think, about how to listen, and to listen not with just the ears, but I heard you listening from the heart, right? And I would add, given this book, to read from the heart, to really grasp, the real human impact of, and so it's not just kind of head work. And that's always been the challenge for anyone who educates around, these matters. It's easy to tell the story, but the heart work, I found, especially, working with survivors of residential schools, it sadly often took people listening directly to a survivor to really get it at a heart level. It was really hard to communicate that as an, so if you're getting, she's able to communicate at a level that strikes the heart. And that's really, really critical in terms of change.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I agree. James.
Thanks very much. Laurie spoke of something that I thought, or I noticed in the book, and that is the two streams of action, the practical, we have to deal with boil water issues and those sorts of things. And the other side of things, which are more fundamental, or I suppose it's popular to say systemic today, issues that individuals can't really deal with. It's more a matter of governments and organizations that need to deal with them. And our role is to, if I understood her correctly, to encourage, to monitor, to make sure they're acting. And one of the things that came to light, I think probably just after her book was published, was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the action plan from the Government of Canada, which is trying to put together a plan to deal with that enormity of all the things that need to be done to actually enact the rights of the Declaration. And it struck me that it was published in 2023, I think, rather ignominiously. It just appeared on a Friday before I think they prorogued or something, and it's an astonishingly big and large and ambitious plan with assigning all different departments and with responsibilities of things to do. And I don't know whether you have, but I haven't heard anything about what the results of that are coming out, and I don't even know how to go about finding out. Do you?
Yeah, it's a tough one that you raised, James, and it reminds me a couple of things. And I mean, I think your point about continuing, to the degree we all can as voters and people who can write letters to politicians, holding the powers that be accountable for following through, is a tremendous responsibility. And I worry in these days when, so much of the government's focus is now quite understandably focused, on what's going on globally around, the economic system and tariffs and relations with the US, will they, continue the course of keeping reconciliation, a priority for the government. And I'm glad to hear you and and I would hope other church members, will be looking for those action plans and looking for progress. One of the things that I lament as you were speaking, that I just, just killed me how in the dying days of the Martin government, we got the Kelowna Accord, which was going to, had suddenly got all the provinces signing on to the federal government, was going to pour billions into at least that first track, to deal with some of those socioeconomic barriers. And then it died because, of course, we had an election, new government came in and decided that they didn't have to, even though they had a previous government had signed this with the provinces, they didn't have to live into it. So that importance of holding governments accountable for following through on things they plan to do is really, really critical. So yeah, well said. And I'll have to look for that document you're talking about, because I'm not I'm familiar with the act, but I didn't notice an action plan anywhere. So it's good to know one
On
existed.
the Government of Canada, the Justice Department
Right.
website.
Right. Thank you.
I think that, really just the change of government shouldn't really have anything to do with it, because we
Shouldn't.
have separation of powers between church, state, and the public service. And there should be a way of doing it, but somehow government or the politics of it has become too predominant in today's age, don't you think?
Indeed. But as I say, Kelowna was a big shock because we thought it was a done deal. And the fact it wasn't lived into was a real shame. So yeah.
So do look and see if you can find
I will. Thank you.
and share it.
I just wanted to read, I saw Cecile said, I finally found my notes, and I like the term on page 306 that being an agent of true reconciliation means being an in-betweener and caring for all parts of the body. And I love that too. And I think that's the space where some of us get born into, coming from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous backgrounds, including Jody Wilson-Raybould. But also, I think one of my theological mamas, one of the professors that I learned from, and who was, I TA'd for her when she taught summer school at the Vancouver School of Theology, is a Maori theologian named Jenny Tapa, and who said to me at the end of my taking her course and TAing another course, so when you start your PhD, I will be on your committee. And it was not a question. One of the social responses that we have to colonialism is tribalism, and like trying to build up like power that sort of asserts it's sort of like the response to the compulsion to dominate, with like a compulsion to push back against that domination in a way that pits Indigenous communities against each other and within themselves against each other. And we see that with like the BC All Native basketball championships, where my cousin Josiah, who was born in Haiti to Haitian parents, but adopted by a Heiltsuk family and is legally Heiltsuk under the Indian Act. People were trying to say, well, he doesn't have any Heiltsuk blood in him, so he shouldn't be able to play in the All Native tournament. And that kind of that kind of sort of reasserting like a European taxonomies of race and understanding who is classified as what is not actually how we used to accept people into our communities. And so, like my auntie saying to my adopted grandmother said to me once, like, why don't you claim being biracial? Because you're not only Heiltsuk, you're Heiltsuk and English. And I said, because the way my aunties explained it to me is being Heiltsuk doesn't have anything to do with race. I'm Heiltsuk because I'm Heiltsuk. Right. And I think that that's also, for me, it embodies that in-betweener piece of how we relate to each other is that, and I know even from my brother and I both going to graduate school that there's gendered parts of our existence where because our mother was Indigenous and our father was not, and how we related to our parents, like I never questioned the fact that I was Heiltsuk ever. And it took him a long time to understand and reckon with and not feel like he was a pretendian because, you know, we have lighter skin and our dad was white. And we had like very, very different experiences of being Heiltsuk. And, you know, for him, that took moving home to Bella Bella and working there for a decade. And he's and really getting to understand it and embody it in every fiber of who he is and finding comfort in the land and that being the way that he grounded himself. But each of us has our own process for how we come to that work of being in between. But I believe that that in betweenness is part of how we work to reconciliation, that just fighting with each other around like strict boundaries of who's in and who's out and is just replicating the colonial systems that damaged us so much in the first place. I don't know if Laura, you have any thoughts on that, but
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and thanks Cecile for reminding us of that in-betweener comment in the book, because, you know, when she writes about worldview, she's acknowledging that, you know, most of us, you know, have a worldview that is not, you know, is not kind of strictly, you know, from one particular source, even though it may be primarily from an indigenous culture or primarily for another culture, that we're influenced by all, you know, all kinds of cultures. And indeed, you know, for indigenous people, certainly in this day and age, you know, all indigenous people or most, many, you know, have learned how to function in a kind of Western colonial way of being, as well as to, you know, in an indigenous worldview, and so understand how to work, you know, work between cultures. And the more I think, you know, we can learn how to move with integrity, you know, maintaining who we're, you know, our understanding of who we own are, but recognizing how to work, you know, cross-culturally with different worldviews is only gonna strengthen us and allow us to take, you know, again the strengths out of those different worldviews to, you know, to help us move forward together. But yeah, uh, a whole business around identity and it is a, you know, we have to first and foremost recognize that it is because of colonialism that this is such a big issue. You know, that, you
yeah,
know, people were given status or not status, that a group, you know, emerged that was Métis, etc. And other groups are now as rights are now emerging, people are starting to want to think, oh, maybe I should claim that or this. And it's just it's because of colonialism first and foremost that this has become an issue, and it's a real challenge for Indigenous people right now to try to work through those questions. Yeah.
yeah. Even just how much the whole, so I put a link there for the Yellowhead Institute, which is another excellent learning
Mhm.
resource because they do all kinds of yellow papers, not white papers, on different public policy issues. And they have an excellent annual report around where they do a report card on the TRC calls to action. So every year they update where there's been progress made, which is really helpful. But their headlining research paper right now is around pretendians in the academy. And even the way that has like blown up in the last 2 or 3 years makes me like so grateful that that my best friend happened to be chair of worship for General Council 44, and that I could put in my own pieces for my installation of like having my uncles and my, like the hereditary chiefs who are important to me, who claim me as part of our communities, to come and make that public recognition, because all of a sudden I was like, oh man, I got really white skin, and like don't like there I think like including that in my installation makes it like really clear who I am and where I'm from. And I was so grateful for that, because it is a challenging thing for us to figure out. And I think that there has to be grace within Indigenous communities around that too, right? That some people, because of 60 Scoop, because of residential schools, don't know their families of origin and may just be reconnecting with them. Like there's a Vancouver City Councillor, Andrea Reimer, who never claimed she was Indigenous, and then she found out she um was a 60 Scoop kid, that she had been adopted out of a Blackfoot or Cree community, I can't remember which, and reconnected with her family of like her birth family. But and so now is starting to claim she's Indigenous, but also has like really made an intentional effort to go to where she's from and to connect with the community and to build a relationship with her birth mother and to learn the language. And that happens in different stages and places for everyone. I was thinking about the understanding and how sometimes we need to like it takes embodied experiences, either from getting to know somebody in an intimate friendship, or having an Indigenous person marry into your family or something. But then like the way that the Kairos blanket exercise really has embodied understanding of colonialism for peoples in the church, but outside of the church too, has been really important. I'm not forgetting the time, Ellen. And I remember my executive director, when I worked at EcoJustice, would say to me, like, I don't, as he got to know me and he got to know some of the harder parts of my history, he would say, I don't know how people like you exist. Like when you just look at like the sheer force of systems that were like set out to destroy you, how can you be like 17 years sober and like almost finish your PhD and like successful and happy when everything in this world said that you shouldn't exist? And I kind of laughed it off. And then the next year was my first year at First United, and I had the opportunity to do the blanket exercise. I was speaking at a conference at St. Andrews, and part of the thing was doing the blanket exercise, and I got to be like one of the last people standing on a blanket, and I was like, I am a miracle. And I like for the first time I like really understood not just the history of the genocide of my own people, but like how that was writ large across the country. And I was like, oh, he wasn't being like hyperbolic. Like it is a miracle that any of us are still here, and a testament to our resilience. And it's not easy, and it's not easy to be in leadership in the church as an Indigenous person. I know for a fact that that is true for Lori. um and we've, especially in this past year, we've had to navigate some really tough stuff where we're starting out our own things in the Indigenous church, in not always productive ways, and at a time when the whole church is kind of spotlighting on the Indigenous church, which is hard because it feels a little fishbowly. So without going into that discussion, I'll just say thank you, Lori, for everything that you've done in service to the church and our country and the TRC. And thank you for your discussion of this book. And I'm really glad that it resonated with folks. So thank you.
Really enjoyed the conversation this evening. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And I'm sad to say that next month is going to be our last book club meeting, and we are finishing with another centennial edition of the book club, which is highlighting United Church authors. And Janet, are you still here? I know Janet, you are. Can we spotlight Janet just for a second? So this is Janet Gear, who you might have encountered in previous book club meetings before, but Janet is the author of our next book next month, which is Undivided Love. And Janet, do you want to give your 10-second elevator pitch about your book?
Well, I can give a 10-second elevator pitch for how much I'm looking forward to the conversation, because the book is about all of you. So I'm looking forward to it.
Right. Janet's very modest. She wrote a book that looked at like how many of you may know that sometimes other denominations will say the United Church doesn't have a theology. And Janet argues in her book that we are not bereft of theologies in the United Church. We have many, many theologies. We have an abundance of theologies. And sometimes that makes it feel like there's not like one particular, biblical commitment or, canonical tradition that we can hang our hat on. And so she tried to develop some models for how we understand church. And why that can be a blessing and contribute to the inclusivity and diversity of the church, and why it can sometimes cause conflict in the church. And I've been a part of Janet's leadership. She does workshops around this book where helping communities to figure out who they are and how to articulate who they are theologically. And so we're really looking forward to talking with you about the book next month.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you then.
All right. See you then. And I don't know the date, but it's like a month-ish from now. So same time, same place.
29th of May.
29th of May. And that will be our last book club session. So unless I decide to do something again from Emmanuel College or something in 2026, I'm going to go on sabbatical this fall. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next month.